Good evening. Hello everybody and welcome to Germany today. I'm not at home, I'm in Germany. If you've been following my Instagram today, you'll know had a slightly surreal and weird flight. I've got my my face masks, a selection of face masks. I've got my hand gel and everything else required. And I've found myself in Germany because tomorrow I'm here working for BMW on a film that we're making. It's quite an exciting time, but also quite a weird and nervous time. Exciting because this is my first job in 3 months. And that's, you know, I'm laughing, but that's a sort of nervous laugh. That's a laugh because I've literally done no work other than what you see me do here on YouTube, which definitely doesn't pay the mortgage. I haven't had any work. So this is a really nice kind of, you know, momentous occasion for me that the work is hopefully starting to come back. I guess weird in that, you know, I fly almost every week in the old normal situation, and yet now it felt like the most alien thing in the world. Getting onto a plane in these different protocols, weirdly really busy airport, very busy flight as well. Everybody wearing the masks. But anyway, I got myself here. It's absolutely fine. We're all good to go and hopefully have a great day tomorrow. I'm of course making a video of this whole trip, including what I'm filming tomorrow as well. So you get to see that at some point later this week. But that's enough about me and where I am. Whereabouts are you lot? I can already see loads of people saying hello. So some from Alex Cooper from the Wirral in England. Terry Sabatine in Colorado, USA. Good evening, or good afternoon, I guess it is from you. Alan Stewart, hello from Scotland. The Gold Coast in Australia, Steve Leach, hello mate, good morning to you. New Orleans, Jack Mundo, checking in from the US. What else have we got? Good evening from West Lothian in Scotland, John Shops. Hang on, no, that's the wrong one. Nigeria. Obina Ehirim and Netherlands to the games. Bethnal Green in London, John Stout. Australia, Farnborough, Uruguay, Denmark, Kings Lynn in Norfolk. So many people tuning in from all over the world, which I thoroughly appreciate. I know I say this all the time, but I really still find this amazing when we do this part. Istanbul in Turkey, somebody there, Maranello. Devon, Ryan Bird from Devon. I could do this all night, but I won't because it would make a really boring video. And at the end of tonight, I mean, I found, if you've also been watching my Instagram today, you'll know that for me being locked down in the UK for the last 3 months with shops and pubs all closed, I mean, I like a beer. Get to Germany, there's bars open. There's a bar open with proper glass pints. So I've got one, I've had one already. I've got that one that's going to get me through the show tonight. And then we've got, where is it? That one. Which that one there is my little teaser for the end of the show, which I cannot wait to get stuck into. So let's crack on because I've got some really good, a good selection of questions from you lot today. It's also been great chatting to you all in the chat section before we came on air. So really appreciate you all coming on early. That's great. But let's get into the questions because as the title of the video suggests, we're going to start off with this one from Perran Williams, who says, do you expect a protest from Red Bull or Ferrari to the DAS system when we get to Austria? And that's quite an interesting question when you start to think about it a bit more. Of course, Red Bull, particularly, notably Red Bull, were talking about protesting Mercedes' DAS system if they'd used it in Australia. Now, there are a number of reasons why they would want to protest it. They believe they have found enough evidence to suggest that it's illegal, that it breaks some regulations, and that could be from movable aerodynamic aids on the car, which are banned. It could be from adjusting suspension out on the racetrack, which is also illegal. The way Mercedes have interpreted this rule is that they're calling it a steering mechanism and not a suspension system, and it's the steering that's moving, not the suspension. They say that they've been to the FIA in the build-up to this season, in the development phase, run it by them, and they have been given an interpretation by the FIA to say that they think, yes, it's probably legal. So why all the fuss then? Now, this is something that's often slightly confusing. When we get to a race weekend, a car can only be deemed legal or otherwise by the race stewards. They are FIA race stewards at that particular event, but they are governing the cars and the technology over the course of that weekend. They're the people that decide on in-race penalties, they also govern over protests that may come during a Grand Prix weekend. You can only really protest a car once it's taken part in the event. So that is once it's rolled out on a racetrack. You can't protest somebody thinking about putting a car into a race with something that you think is illegal. So they can only really get a protest when we get a car on the racetrack. Of course, we didn't get that in Australia, which means we're now in that situation where we're nowhere nearer knowing what the race stewards would how they would view this system if it were to be used and then protested. So will Red Bull go ahead with the protest that they were absolutely planning to put in Australia? There's two ways to look at this. First is, yes, they will go, if Mercedes use it, and that's another big if, we'll get onto in a minute. If they use it, Red Bull would continue with their protest, really on the grounds of just clarifying whether this system's legal or not. And let's not forget, Red Bull see themselves as Mercedes' biggest rivals for the championship. So if they can find a way to peg back Mercedes in any way, shape or form, they will 100% take it. So that's why they would protest it. There's also the argument that they may not use it because we're now so much further into the season that the consequences of being protested and found to have an illegal car and therefore be disqualified from a race result in a championship where you're going to have far fewer races than originally planned, that disqualification would be far harder hitting than it would be in a full 22 race calendar. So there's a big question mark over whether Mercedes deem this to be worthy of going through the process. The only data they have on that is from what they did in pre-season testing and of course all the simulation work. Now, none of us really know just quite how beneficial it is. I've done a video on what the benefits would be and they're quite far reaching, but actually the numbers involved in those and how great an advantage they might be, well, only Mercedes will know that. So I think it's quite an interesting one to work out whether they will actually use it. My gut feeling, and this is based on nothing more than a gut feeling, is that they probably won't use it. But that's just my feeling, given that the risk versus reward, I think, is not going to be great enough. I think they've got a car fast enough to challenge for a world title in this weird and unprecedented season without needing DAS, and particularly given that it won't be around next year and beyond anyway because it's already banned in those regulations, it feels like a risk probably not worth taking. Let's see what you guys are saying on this, because I think most fans would love to see it and feel it's probably a bit of a shame that it has been banned, because it's one of those brilliant innovations that we don't see very often, that's so visually different, and that's what we're missing a lot of the time from Formula One, where the cars look so similar. So in an engineering sense, I really would love to see it run over a race weekend, but let's see what you guys think. Christian Horner has one objective, and that's to sell fizzy drinks. Of course they will protest, says Nick 9737. I do believe that if Mercedes run it, they will protest. Of course they will, because they think they're going to be in this real tight championship fight, and they will take any advantage they can get on that. Ren T says it would be a shame not to use it, even if it's just for data analysis. Well, they could use it in a practice session, of course, and see if it gets protested at that point. But the reality is that a Red Bull or a Ferrari are unlikely to put in a protest until it's used in a competitive session like qualifying, or more likely even the race. Because the advantage to the protester, i.e. Red Bull, is greater if they can have that opposition team disqualified from a race, whereas if they protest it after a Friday practice session, they'll just get told to take it off the car. So I suspect we wouldn't see that happen until the really meaty part of the race weekend. I think Marc feel that they've got a watertight case, so we'll run it, says Joseph Richards. That is the other side, that's Mercedes' side. They would not have gone this far in terms of developing a system like this, revealing it to the world, which they knew was going to happen when they ran it in pre-season testing, if they didn't firmly believe that, first of all, it was legal, and secondly, that it was a significant advantage. It wouldn't be cheap, it wouldn't be easy to achieve, so they've gone to considerable lengths. So on that side, if they see it's a significant enough advantage, maybe they will run it. That's something that we'll have to wait and see. It would be a shame not to see it, though. Sir Digby Chicken Caesar says Red Bull will only protest because they're pissed that they never thought of it first. Probably right, and that's that's the case with most of these things, isn't it? It's a really interesting system. This is what the front end of the car looks like. You can't really see very much, of course, from that because the meaty part of that system is all buried well behind all of that you see there. And actually, Formula One car, you can see very little these days because there's hardly any space. Very deliberately, there's no openings and no gaps, partly because they don't want anything seen, but secondly because space is something that's not necessarily needed on a Formula One car. If it's space, it shouldn't be there. So my feeling on that is still undecided. I think that if it's run, Red Bull will definitely lodge a protest, in my opinion. Whether it's run, though, that's the big question. Gut feeling says probably no. Right, let us move on to a next question. The next one comes from Simon Hill, who says this: with the possibility of mechanics having to isolate, do teams have reserves for pit stops? And this, of course, refers to, you know, if we go through a season in 2020 where there's a risk where people are being tested for COVID-19 every 2 days, there is a possibility that somebody within the Formula One circus, maybe part of a pit stop crew, could test positive and then will immediately have to go into isolation for a period of 14 days, I believe. And that would take them out of action for at least one race, probably more than that. So do the teams have reserves? Under normal circumstances, not really. There are obviously a huge number of people at the factory working at most factory Formula One teams. Many of those people are ex-race team mechanics. That tends to be the way that a lot of this happens. When you've been on the race team for a number of years, maybe if the travel gets too much for you in the end, you might take a role factory-based back at the team's headquarters. Those people all have considerable experience of doing pit stops, and those will be the people that teams will call on first in that situation. And I suspect right now, and I actually meant to try and check this before I came out, but I didn't get time. I suspect that most teams now will be looking at backup pit stop reserve positions from people within their own factories for exactly that reason. Because Simon, you're absolutely right. If this happens, what you absolutely need over and above everything else in terms of pit stops is consistency. And losing one person or two people or more than that can just wreak havoc with your consistency. So having a backup crew in this situation, or backup people that can drop in, is absolutely more important than ever, and I suspect they're all working on that right now. But good question though. Let's go on to the next one. I'm sorry I have to get a black screen every time I change the question, but that's just the way this software works. Vonel says, what do you think of the F1 Games driver ratings? Bottas higher than Leclerc and Vettel. Now this has generated so much discussion online. I'm a big fan of the F1 Games. I've been a big fan of the virtual F1 season. Congrats to George Russell, by the way, on that. So he's done very well, hasn't he? But for the 2020 game, they have a little bit like FIFA does with the football players, give them all ratings based on certain things, and I've got them here. So let's have a look. In fact, let's look at this one first. This is F1's full driver ratings. They've rated every driver on the grid in terms of experience, racecraft, awareness, and pace, and from that they've come up with an overall figure out of 100, that is, and they've put all the drivers with a rating. Now, very kindly, the guys at the race have gone to the lengths of putting that into a table based on those overall positions, and it looks like this. Lewis Hamilton, unsurprisingly, at the top with an overall rating of 94. It's Verstappen next. Bottas on the same number as Max Verstappen. Thoughts on that, please? Ahead of Sebastian Vettel on 89, Daniel Ricciardo 87, Kimi on 87 as well, Charles Leclerc on 86. I guess the surprise, as it was in your question there, Vanel, Valtteri Bottas right up there in third. What do you think on that? It's quite an interesting one, wasn't it? The other interesting one I thought, actually, before we go off this screen, Romain Grosjean about halfway down the table there, ahead of Ocon, Gasly, Albon, Norris. Some interesting names there. George Russell. Of course, the experience is what will have let a lot of those guys down, but Romain Grosjean that far up the grid, up the order. I'd like to know your thoughts on that as well. It's really interesting though, because it's generated so much discussion. Formula One fans are so passionate about all this. I'm going to dip into your comments in a minute. But I would have really loved to have been in or fly on the wall in those discussions at Codemasters when they were having those chats about how they were going to rate each of those drivers. So Lewis Hamilton 4 points ahead of his nearest rival, which is Bottas and Verstappen. Here we go, let's see what you've got here. Josh Smith says, savage to put Ocon second from bottom. No, Ocon's not second from bottom, Josh. He was in the, that's just in the table, or the list of drivers. In the table, he's not second from bottom, I don't think, was he? Let's have a look, I don't think he was. Ocon, no. Ocon up there, he's about just below halfway down. But still, interesting that he's behind some others. Kimi Räikkönen is the GOAT. Russell needs to go up rather a lot, says Nick 9737. I think what will happen here, of course, part of this rating is based on experience, driver experience, of which George Russell doesn't have very much. The same with some of the others, Lando Norris. I think they will grow to be incredible talent. They're already great talents. But in the driver rating category, that will take time to bring up that experience number to lift them up. So it is slightly misleading. It's not just a judge of how good a driver in the, right now these people are, but it's based on a number of factors. But I think they're all quite interesting factors. Did you notice your son was typing you in the chat, Mr. Blue Sky? No, I didn't. Rex Priestley, you're supposed to be in bed. I wonder why a few people were saying hello to Rex. So he hasn't even got a YouTube account. What's he doing typing on my computer? Anyway, Russell that far down shows the tables are meaningless, says Sandy Barnes. Well, they are a bit of fun, and that's all they are, is a bit of fun. Let's face it. It's a little bit like your Panini football stickers, isn't it? Or like the FIFA Ultimate Team ratings. It is just for a bit of fun. It's not supposed to be how we judge the drivers in their overall capacity, but it does give us a means of putting them into some kind of order based on these factors. So I think that's quite interesting. Ratings are data derived, says Base Punk. Yeah, absolutely, they are data driven, but a big part of that data is the experience, and that, no matter how good you are, if you haven't done many races, will pull you down the order, of course. Marc said a crash cost the team £300,000 each time. Will Bennett, sorry mate, I'm not sure exactly what you mean there. Vonel tuned in just at the right time to see a question. Thank you very much for asking it. I'm afraid we're about to leave it though, because it's a great question, and it's going to generate loads of discussion, I'm sure, that will continue. But I think, Rex, you're grounded, says Josh Smith. You are. Anyway, thank you, Vonel, for the question. I do appreciate that. But let us move on to the next one, which comes from Alex Popescu, who says, hey Mark, I've been re-watching a lot of the old F1 races, and a question occurred to me. When race control activates DRS after the third lap or so, how does that actually work? Do they send some sort of signal to the cars that activates it? Excuse me, cheers. Well, yes, is the answer to that, Alex. What they do is the DRS system works off the embedded timing loop in the racetrack. So the circuit is divided up into lots of mini sectors around the racetrack with a timing loop buried into the surface of the circuit. So it knows when cars travel over it, and it knows which car's travelling over it, in real time. So what the FIA can do, or what race control can do, is send a signal through the timing loop to activate DRS after the end of that second lap, or the beginning of the third lap. And what that does then is activate the standard ECU inside the car. So everybody has exactly the same McLaren designed and manufactured standard ECU. That's linked into the timing system as well. Once it gets that signal from race control, it activates the system on board the car, so that as soon as you get within that 1 second of the car in front and you're in the activation zone, you get the little blue light pop up on the screen, or some drivers have a tone pop up in the ear to let them know that it's active, and now they can press the button to open the rear wing. So that's how it works. So yes, in answer, that is pretty much what they do. They send a signal to the cars via the timing loop embedded in the racetrack. Let's see. 10, Johnny Scott says 10 out of 10 to Rex for using his dad's account. PS, no pocket money this week. You wait till I get home. Alex Cooper, DAS is only legal for 2020, not in 2021. Yes, that's correct. Do you think Maranello will get a race this autumn, says Tron Das, since quite a few of the Asian leg races are gone. What about others? We'll get onto that in more depth, I think, in a moment. But Maranello, of course not, but Mugello, quite possibly. But I think we'll talk about circuits in a bit more depth in a moment. Let's go on to the next question, which this time comes from Adonis, who says, what happens if a driver pees in his car during a race? Surely that's a big risk to everybody. Well, in these times when we're trying to be hygienic and keep everybody safe, good point. It happens, by the way. Drivers do pee in their seats, and it's one of those horrible situations. It doesn't happen very often, I have to say, not in my experience anyway. Some drivers clearly worse than others, but you do see them all typically run off the grid before a start of a race, and what they're doing quite often is running off to go to the toilet. So most drivers will go to the toilet before the start of the race and then come back, but even so, some drivers will go for a wee in their seat, and well, traditionally that part of the car would fall to the front end mechanic, which back in when I first started at McLaren, that was my role, was front end mechanic. I looked after everything from the fuel cell forward. So the driver cockpit, the front suspension, and the driver's seat, of course, falls into that. In some races, the seat will come back drenched anyway because the driver's been sweaty. I know this is not a nice chat for a Monday evening. But look, the truth is, if a driver's got to go, what else is he going to do? There's no... He can't pull off the track and stop, can he? So he is going to go in his race suit and ultimately in his race seat. In my experience, when that happened, and it only ever happened to me once, shall I tell you the driver? David Coulthard. David's one of these guys that, that does it or did it more often than not. I just put his seat out to dry and left it, and he got back in it the next week, and I said no more about it. But there you go. It does happen, Adonis, and yes, I guess there is a health risk or a hygiene risk attached to that. I don't know if they've got any special plans in place to deal with it, but perhaps we should be asking that question. Next question from the Gingerbread Man. The Gingerbread Man says, now that a calendar has been drafted and some races definitively out for 2020, will the teams change their car designs to suit these tracks? Do the cars change normally after Monaco when the slowest hairpin has been dealt with? So no, they don't change inherently, though they don't change the car after Monaco. But of course the car's changing on a weekly basis. So they're not redesigning the chassis or the car itself, the suspension typically. Monaco will have its own unique setup, just like many of the other circuits will, like Monza, like others. So we won't be needing that Monza setup as things stand now, Monaco setup to deal with the tight hairpin. Sometimes you'll put in a special steering rack with extra lock, and occasionally you might need to have a modified set of suspension to account for that extra lock. But typically the cars are designed to cope with everything that a Grand Prix season sends their way. So a car will typically be able to cope with everything from the tight hairpin at Monaco to the flat out low drag situation of Monza, and along the way they'll just tweak the aero package and things like floors and wings and parts of bodywork and other items as we go across the season. So they're not going to be redesigning the cars, but what's interesting is we are, as things stand, we're going into the start of this season, the start of this European leg on the 5th of July, as things stand, not knowing how we'll finish it, or how many races there are, or even which circuits are going to come up later in the season. And this is where we'll get on to perhaps a bit of chat about race circuits, because I think that's quite interesting. Somebody mentioned earlier on there at Mugello a number of circuits in the mix as potential replacements for some of those that have been lost. Magello definitely won, which is a great place to go. I love going to Magello. We used to go testing there quite a lot. In fact, there's some interesting stories in my book about going testing in Magello, given that it's a Ferrari circuit, and back then we were McLaren, perhaps the biggest rivals to Ferrari. We actually had the whole garage swept for bugs and listening devices when we turned up, because it was the first time we'd ever been to Magello. Ferrari had invited us, and we were so paranoid about the espionage situation back then. So anyway, I digress. That's an interesting one for another time. But yeah, a number of other circuits, and as a few of you are already mentioning in the comments there, Bahrain, which is highly likely to host at least one race, but quite probably two at the end of the season. Bahrain has now been touted as offering up potentially a second circuit layout. This is what it looks like. This is the outer perimeter racetrack at the Bahrain International Circuit. Now you can see in the middle of that drawing the traditional F1 circuit that we all know. The outer perimeter track is only really used for track days. It's an incredibly fast circuit, as you can see. It still has some corners, but not that many. But crucially, it falls, well, two things. First of all, it is Grade 1 FIA approved, which means it could slot straight into a role on the F1 calendar, which would be great. And the other reason that it's FIA approved is that it's over the minimum of 3.5 kilometres stipulated by the FIA for a Grand Prix circuit's length. Now, Silverstone's national circuit, because a lot of people have talked about that, perhaps doing the same thing at the second round at Silverstone, perhaps mix it up by going to one of their other layouts. Silverstone National Circuit is not long enough to be able to do that. It falls just under 3 kilometres. Bahrain, though, is feasible, and I actually think it's quite an interesting circuit. I'd love to see this. A brand new circuit on the calendar that nobody has any data for. They would all have to find that out on the Friday practice. We would have perhaps a really mixed up weekend, given that the first weekend will be something that's very much a known quantity in the middle bit, the traditional circuit. If we go to the second weekend and have this one, everybody is going to be learning from the same spot, from the same benchmark when we get there for the second weekend, which I think will be really quite interesting, don't you? So I think lots of other circuits could potentially come into play. Hockenheim has been mentioned, of course. The circuit in the Algarve in Portugal, which, by the way, is a fantastic racetrack. I drove around it last year. You may remember I did a video in when they launched the I-Pace, Jaguar's I-Pace. We had an amazing trip out there. And it's just a fantastic roller coaster of a circuit, sweeping. It's brilliantly set up with excellent facilities, loads of space. It's kind of the perfect place to slot in a race right now. So also FIA Grade 1 approved, which means it could work. So that's another great one. Let's see, anybody else got any other suggestions of where F1 might go? But Abu Dhabi, of course, also another circuit that's being talked about for the end of the season, which could potentially hold 2 races, and possibly others. We've lost a couple this week, of course, haven't we? Singapore's gone, Baku's gone. So we do need to find some more races. At the moment, we've only got European rounds on the calendar confirmed. There is a line in the regulations that says to be classified as an F1 World Championship, you need at least 8 races, but you also need to go to at least 3 continents. Well, the FIA have already said that that won't be the case this year, and they are able to change the rules at short notice to enable us to not need to fulfil that requirement. So even if we only stayed in Europe, it would still classify as a World Championship. Nürburgring, says Sean. I mean, absolutely. How good with that? Not quite F1 standards, not if you're talking about the Nordschleife, but how good would that be? Vasmore7 says Algarve is a great idea. Sandy Barnes says Canada, yeah, could well still get something in Canada. Kota says GR8 UK, Mexico City and Brazil. Brazil obviously been pretty harshly hit by COVID-19, still real serious travel restrictions to the States. So a lot of these things, and even places like Bahrain, are still subject to travel restrictions and government restrictions being lifted at nearer the time. So very much up in the air. Eox says, so is Silverstone just going to be exactly the same over the course of their 2 races? No, it won't be, because at Silverstone, because we can't alter the layout, they've actually changed the tyre nomination for the 2nd race, which is, I think, going to be called the 70th anniversary Grand Prix or something like that, isn't it? So there will be differences there. So it's a case of just finding something to try and mix it up on the 2nd weekend. And actually, some of these, probably Silverstone is a great example, will almost certainly be spoilt, at least one of those, by weather, given that it's the UK. Yas Marina could do multiple layouts, says Jacko 3275. Absolutely. So Bahrain and Yas Marina are 2 perfect circuits for this type of situation that can offer some variation in what we have from one weekend to the next. Do the Arabian circuits count as European circuits, says Simon Burling? When you mean, well, it depends what you're talking about. No, they don't. So if you mean, do the Arabian circuits count as European circuits? No, they don't. Not if you're talking about places like Bahrain and Abu Dhabi, absolutely not. The only one that reason I was questioning that was because the other circuit that was mentioned was Turkey, Istanbul Park, which also would be amazing. And of course that circuit sits halfway between Europe and Asia, doesn't it? It actually sits across the border, so it's in 2 continents, that one, so that would be interesting. Dominic Stevens says Le Mans. Yeah, I mean, come on, who wouldn't want to see F1 cars going around Le Mans? It'd be awesome, wouldn't it? And the other one I'd love to see, it can't happen because it's not FIA approved, but Brands Hatch Grand Prix circuit. I'd love us to go back there, it'd be great, particularly on a personal level, because it's where I grew up, where this whole motor racing journey started for me. Right, let me move on to another question. Let me see, we've got this one from F1AHM, who says, hypothetical question mark, what's better and more balanced for current F1 cars? Having half a front wing broken on one side and intact on the other, or having no front wing at all? So in other words, does bilateral damage balance the car more than unilateral damage? That's an interesting one, but it's a fairly simple answer in that having half of your front wing, although your aero's utterly messed up if you've lost half your front wing, let's make no mistake about that. But the front wing is not just about producing downforce. In fact, it's not its main job. Its main job is controlling or conditioning the flow towards the rear of the car and the places like the diffuser. So if you've got half of it, you will still get some of that effect. If you've lost it all, the entire rear end of your car, as well as the front end of your car, will not be working. So the truth is that the car's in a really terrible state if it's lost even half of its front wing, and it would necessitate a pit stop to get a new one, because the time loss would be so significant it wouldn't be worth your while running around with it on there. But to answer your question, you would still be better off with half a front wing than no front wing at all. Still some suggestions coming in. Dubai Autodrome, another good shout there. Yep, love to see that. Adelaide is corona free and the most perfect street track the world ever saw. Well, Thomas Smith, I'm not going to disagree with that, because I'd love to see cars go back to Adelaide, but a street circuit is probably one of the most difficult to set up in short notice like this, because of so much work in assembling the circuit like that. So we're much more likely to be able to have a permanent racetrack, certainly if we're looking at doing 2 race weekends. Let's see, Mugello and Nürburgring, says Carl TV. Paul Ricard makes me dizzy looking at all that striping, says GR8UK. Yeah, let's not go to Paul Ricard. Fuji, Vignesh Balashubramaniam. I'm sorry, I've almost certainly pronounced your name terribly, but Fuji is a good shout. Right, let's go on to another question. We have got this one next from John Jedison. John, question. Oh no, hang on, that's not it. There we go, John Jedison. Hi Mark, he says, sorry if this is a silly question, but if the dimples on a golf ball reduce the drag coefficient, why don't we see some dimpled surfaces on F1 cars? Does it have to be a spherical surface before it works? Love the videos. Thanks very much, John. This is a sort of perennial question, isn't it? Dimples on Formula 1 cars. In fact, if you go back through my channel, there is a video on that very subject that I did last year, I think. So dimples on a golf ball work. The point of the dimples is to break up the boundary layer around the golf ball. Now, if you didn't have dimples, if you had a very smooth golf ball, what happens is you get something called a laminar boundary layer, where it's sort of layers of airflow hitting the golf ball following its surface. What happens in that situation with that laminar flow around the surface or the boundary layer is it separates very quickly. As it comes over the top and the bottom of the ball, the trailing wake becomes huge and draggy because the boundary layer separates as it leaves the ball and makes this huge wide wake. If you introduce the dimples, it actually creates drag, believe it or not, just a tiny amount of turbulence in each one of those little pockets just around the surface layer or the boundary layer of the golf ball. And what that does is helps to keep that flow attached to the boundary. So the boundary layer becomes turbulent and remains attached to the contours of the golf ball, meaning that the turbulent wake off the back is much thinner, it's much more controlled, and it doesn't leave this really wide, messy trailing wake. I hope that's simple enough and made some sense. Why we don't have it on a Formula One car, two things. First of all, we have lots of other devices, given that a Formula One car is huge and all sorts of different shapes, lots of other devices that create keep the flow attached to the surfaces. We have things like vortex generators, we have much more complex shapes on a Formula One car that enable us to keep that boundary layer attached and not separate. So we don't need the dimples for that effect. The other reason is that, of course, the single most important thing with a golf ball is that it goes as far as it can. It's about getting through the air as efficiently and going as far as possible. Whereas the airflow over a Formula One car, yes, it has to be efficient, but actually quite often many of the surfaces on a Formula One car are not actually about generating downforce or anything like that. They're about directing the flow to other parts of the car. So the two items, a Formula One car and a golf ball, have very different purposes, and of course they're very different shapes, which mean that one doesn't necessarily perform the same solution on the other. So Formula One teams, I know because at McLaren we definitely tried it out in the R&D department, or surfaces like that, the shark skin type surfaces as well. We tried it out on certain elements, but the reality is it isn't worth it. It doesn't give an advantage over and above what we can currently do with modern aerodynamics across the entire Formula One car, with all of the tools and flick-ups and flaps and devices that we have there available to us. So there we go, that was quite a long and drawn-out explanation. I hope I didn't lose you, I hope that made some sense. Malcolm McLeod says the golf ball also rotates, absolutely. So we always know the direction of flow on a Formula One car because it's normally always going forwards. With a golf ball, of course, it's spinning in all directions, so we can't control that as much. So that's again why we need to try and minimise that wake coming off the golf ball and put some energy into that boundary layer with the little dimples around the surface. So yes, I hope that made some sense there. Let me see. HiFi Tommy says, better late than never. Better late than never. Hi Mark. Hi guys. Yeah. Hi Tommy. Welcome along. No use Mexico or Canada race because the COVID rate are still too high, says Cosmos 2017. So still talking about circuits. Yeah, much of this is going to be still reliant on local governments relaxing restrictions on how the virus develops and the spread of the virus develops in those places as well. So there's loads still to be worked out, and we may even find that as the season goes on, the calendar ends up changing even once we're all on the road. So it's going to be a really weird and strange season, I have to say. So Can Cracker says, so golf ball dimples would work for spinning cars. If your car was perfectly spherical and spinning, then yes, it would work. Bring back the Malaysian Grand Prix, says _killer. What do you think? I really like the Malaysian Grand Prix. I thought it was a great circuit. I used to love going there as well. I think it's a real shame that one's gone, but there you go. Freddie, will you have to go into quarantine when you return to the UK? I will. So yes, that was a decision that I had to make coming out here to Germany was, yes, I do have to quarantine for 14 days when I get back. But I've been basically quarantined for 3 months now. I've got nothing else in terms of travel planned over the next 2 weeks, so I've factored that into my schedule. I've made some preparations for that, so we're all good to go. So I don't think it's going to be too much of an impact for me. I was winding Claire up the other day saying that I'm going to get a little bell and be sat on my sofa and just ring it when I need her to go and get something for me because I can't go out. But there we go. Right, Dan Lane says, Andy Cowell set to leave Mercedes. Toto next. So yes, you may have seen this today. Andy Cowell has announced, or Mercedes have announced, that Andy Cowell will be leaving his role at Mercedes HPPE, High Performance Power Trains. So that's significant. He's a managing director. He's been absolutely instrumental in building their success. So it's significant. But, you know, this decision was taken way back at the start of this year. And so they've only announced it today because they've been putting plans in place. And that's what Mercedes have been very good at. They've lost some really significant key personnel over their dominant period since 2014. And yet they're still dominant. So they are very good at creating a succession plan. They've got a great process in place at Mercedes, which means that if you get some very good people, which they've got, they can fit into the process. And that's what they've built, is a really strong team. Not a strong group of individuals, but a really strong team. So I don't expect them to be hit too hard by it, although he is undoubtedly a loss. Will Toto be next? The big question. Toto says he's hanging around for 2020, but beyond that, we still do not know. It's ominous by his silence about what happens beyond 2020. So, yeah, thoughts? I don't know. Not sure on that one. Only he knows, I guess, at this stage. Gust says, Racing Point now waiting by the phone. Andy, call us. I don't know what Andy's doing next. I don't have any inside information as to what his next plans are, so I'm afraid I don't know on that one. Let's get on to another question before we start to think about wrapping this up and I can crack on with that pint over my shoulder. The next question comes from Hasse, who says, Mark, if you can bring back an innovation from the past, and I want your thoughts on this, if you can bring back an innovation from the past that was banned, for example, active suspension, and added it to the current cars, which innovation would yield the most amount of downforce? And also, how much faster will these cars be if there was no weight limit? Right, so innovations that got banned, you mentioned active suspension. I'd love to see that back. I really would. I think it's a fascinating, from an engineering perspective, it's a fascinating bit of technology, and what it does to the cars is transform them. But to be more specific about which one's going to yield the most downforce, well, most of the best innovations in F1 history are actually not about necessarily just about producing downforce, were they? I mean, the ones that are obvious exceptions to that would be the double diffuser in my mind, and obviously side skirts. You know, from the ground effect cars of the sort of 80s, they clearly made a huge impact in terms of downforce. So, you know, we're going to get something like that back next year or 2022 with a new generation of cars. Not the skirts, we're not going to get to the same effect, but shaping the underside of the car to generate more of a ground effect. We will see. So yeah, blown diffuser, ground effect skirts. Says Marc Ronell, ground effect fans. Jason Lovett, yeah, the giant fan. That's a great one. The great fan on the back of the Brabham, which was used. You must have seen it. A giant fan on the back, which is used to effectively suck the airflow through the car, through the underside of the car, which was sealed to the racetrack with the side skirts, creating this incredibly low pressure zone under the car, which pulled the car down the racetrack and gave it incredible grip. Amazing innovation. So yes, things like that, I love it. Riley C said, I'd bring back the Fduct. Simple solution with incredible effects on the car, and Mercedes double DRS system they had. What genius that was. So the Fduct that's actually one of my favourite innovations, as you said there, Riley, because it was so simple. Now, that was a McLaren innovation in the beginning. I remember going into the McLaren R&D department when I was there, and one of the guys there showing me it when it was in its very early concept. And I remember being gobsmacked, blown away when I saw what they were up to in there, because it was so brilliant and yet so simple. And it was called the Fduct, for those who don't know, because the opening, the little duct, just popped out through the F of Vodafone. which is our main title sponsor on the top of the car. So that's where it came from, that's where the name came from. But such a brilliant innovation, and yes, was quite an effective tool for not producing downforce, but dumping drag along the straights. So really clever stuff, I love that. Josh Smith says Fduct was basically DRS. Yes, it was. It was a forerunner to DRS, but it was ours, and that's what gave us an advantage for a period of time before everybody else began to cotton on. Bring back Maldonado, F1 fan 89. What about the tuned mass dampers? Yep, Cheng Loke NG. The tuned mass dampers, also really clever bit, not downforce producing in itself, but I think it was Renault, wasn't it, who first came up with those, which was essentially just a giant weight in the front of the car on a spring that would counteract the movement or the bouncing of the car around the racetrack and keep it much more stable. Again, really, really clever. I really love stuff like that. McLaren's third pedal. Remember that one, the rear torque steer system. Again, brilliant. I won't go into the details right now because we'll be here for another hour, but brilliant invention. One of the reasons that I got involved in Formula One personally when I was a kid was because of innovations like that, like the fan car, you know, like the 6-wheel Tyrrell. Stuff like that was what piqued my imagination when I was a kid. And I'm not that old, so I wasn't a kid when these things were being invented. But seeing the pictures of that, having the posters of those cars, well, what got me involved in engineering and ultimately got me involved in Formula One. So I'd love to see more of that. That's why I think DAS is such a brilliant thing. It's simple, it's very kind of effective, but it's something that's visual, that people can see. It will inspire a generation of engineers. Double Diffuser says, HiFi Tommy. Did you ever do a voice on Tuned, says Rockphonic. I didn't. That was the McLaren cartoon. I loved that, by the way. I'd love to see them bring that back. But no, I didn't. I hope McLaren come up with something clever again. I missed that, McLaren, says Josh Smith. Absolutely. Too many great things get banned in F1, says Twist to Open. I mean, I agree with you. I've mentioned this before, but I think this is something that I would really love to see happen now that we've got a budget cap coming in. We've got a budget cap, no one can go crazy on spending, so let's open up the tech regs and just let people innovate, because they can only spend what they can spend, so let them choose what they want to spend it on. And if they want to dream up something like DAS and they feel that it's worth their while to go through that amount of development and R&D, let them do it. I'd love to see, you know, what a lot of the innovations were banned on the grounds of keeping costs down. So now we've got another mechanism to keep costs down. Let's open it up. Let's give them free rein and let those engineers go wild. I'd love to see that. Right, listen, it's 11:15 here, 10:15 back in the UK. I think, well, let me see, I think I've got one more question down here. So let's have this one from Monster Matt, who says, G'day Mark, love your work. Why didn't F1 regulate the size of the cars so they were similar to the size of, say, 2004? Is there a technical reason it hasn't been done before, or it hasn't been done? So why didn't we maximise the length of a car to keep them small? They've grown to this huge length now where they are massive and they're wide and they're heavy. Could we not have regulated that and kept them at a smaller size? And the truth is, I think yes, we could have done that. I don't think there's a technical reason. I mean, yes, the hybrid systems have made the cars, you know, slightly bigger. We need more space to accommodate a lot of that. But let's face it, we had a V12 in many of those cars a few years ago, twice the length, twice the number of cylinders of what we have today. So we must have been able to make cars shorter. The reason that teams don't want to do that is because by making the cars longer, they have more aerodynamic surface, both on top and underneath with the floor, to generate downforce. And because the cars have got faster and faster and faster with the power unit development, they've needed that downforce to keep grip levels up. And so it's one of the reasons we've got incredibly fast cars, the fastest cars we've had ever in Formula One at the moment. If we suddenly said, right, we need to bring that down to a much smaller and shorter car, we would lose a lot of speed. But perhaps we'd gain something in terms of cars being able to fight each other more closely on the racetrack, and maybe we'll get more overtaking. So, Matt, I see your frustration. I don't think there's a technical reason that I know of why we haven't restricted the length. I just think there's never been a restriction. and therefore no one's ever thought to kind of write one in. We do have a width restriction, we have a weight restriction, but there is no overall length restriction. So maybe that's something we could look at in the future, I don't know. But look, thank you so much for all your questions tonight. I really appreciate them all, as ever. I really appreciate you all joining in, honestly I do. I know that it takes an awful lot of time out of your evenings, but I'm really enjoying it, so I hope you guys are too. I will keep you up to date with my travels. If you want to follow me on Instagram, you'll immediately know what I'm up to over the next couple of days, but there will be a vlog coming when I get back, and some more cool stuff coming on the channel later this week and next week as well. So stay tuned. If you're not subscribed already, please do so. Have a great evening. I'm going to go and finish this and that one over there, and I will see you all very, very soon. See you guys. Ta-da!